Today's book is The Story of King Arthur and His Knights by Howard Pyle. Now, let me back up and give a little bit of brief background to this. Howard Pyle was an American illustrator who lived about the turn of the century, late 1800s, early 1900s. I had previously read and reviewed on this channel The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood by Howard Pyle. This is, as far as I can tell by looking at the internet, the definitive version of The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood. It's the version that's had the most influence on Robin Hood as we conceive of him today. So after having read that and being interested in Howard Pyle, I checked my school's library to see what else they had by Howard Pyle, and we have The Story of King Arthur and His Knights. Now, when it comes to King Arthur, there's a lot more competition to be the definitive version, and this is not the definitive or the most famous version of King Arthur, but as you can see, it's still in print nowadays. Originally published in 1903, I didn't realize until I got this home from the library, but if you go onto Wikipedia, this is actually the first of a series of books that Howard Pyle wrote about King Arthur. So this is just the beginning of the adventures. Then I believe there are 3 more books in the series, if I remember correctly. It's all on Wikipedia somewhere, if you search this. For better or for worse, this is the only version that they have at my school library. So I think this is as far as I'm going to be reading in this series, at least for now. A quick note here, and this is only pertains to this version, but Howard Pyle was a famous illustrator. I think he was maybe more famous as an illustrator than he was as an author, although he was famous as both. So the original Howard Pyle book has some gorgeous pictures which are not included in this edition. Instead, they hired some new guy to do the illustrations, and he does some stuff with Scratchboard, which is definitely serviceable. Let me see if I can find an example. For example, here. But doesn't compare with the Howard Pyle originals. It just makes you wonder why. Why, if the original illustrations are so famous, why would they go with some other illustrations? To which I have no idea. I don't really know much about the publishing industry or why these decisions are made or how, but my best guess is that they may have been too expensive for the print layout or whatever of Howard Pyle's more intricate original designs. So I think it's maybe something to be careful about if you care about these kind of things, which edition you get, because I was searching this on Google, and some editions do have the original illustrations. I think those editions tend to be a bit more expensive. Regardless, though, this whole thing is in the public domain. So if you go to the Wikipedia page and then go to the Wikimedia Commons, you can look at the original illustrations that you were missing out from in this book, and that's what I've done. This book was written for children originally in 1903, although like a lot of classic books, I think a child would find it hard going nowadays. I know I did. I actually started reading The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood when I was in 2nd grade and gave up on it. It's written in kind of... it was written in 1903, this one was. But Howard Pyle is deliberately trying to imitate Old English. So he's using... I say Old English, but I mean that in the colloquial sense. It's not Old English in the sense of like the Anglo-Saxon Beowulf or something like that. It's more kind of King James, Shakespearean type English. And so, yeah, the narration would be a little bit difficult, perhaps, for a child nowadays. And the publishers agree with me, for whatever that's worth, because the same guys who published this book, Sterling Classics, they also published a version of the book, which is Classic Starters, which is, I think, the same book, but it's retold from the original by Howard Pyle. So they've got somebody who's gone through and just simplified it into modern English for today's children, and the publishers recommend that's for grades 3 to 6. Nevertheless, I was talking to somebody at my office who did read the original when they were a kid, and I'm sure probably some of you out there who are ambitious readers at a young age may have tackled this when you were younger. My own background with King Arthur, the King Arthur story, is limited. I was never really big into that story when I was a kid. I got into it a few years ago, back in 2014, when I read The Once and Future King by T.H. White. And while I was reading The Once and Future King by T.H. White, at a certain point I realized that this was all based off of Thomas Malory's 15th century La Mort d'Arthur, which is, I think, French for the death of Arthur. Somewhat of a misnomer, if you're familiar with the work, because even though it's called The Death of Arthur, it's really just the whole King Arthur story, from the sword and the stone all the way to his death. And that's what T.H. White was basing his book off of. So I read The Once and Future King, and then once I realized that it was all based off of Malory's The Death of Arthur, I got a hold of The Death of Arthur, La Mort d'Arthur, and I read some of it, and I flipped through it a little bit, and I compared some sections. I never actually read it cover to cover. It's it's a 15th century book. It's a bit of a difficult read, although doable. It would have been doable if I would have stuck with it. I just didn't have the patience for sticking with it. So that's my background with the King Arthur story. Other than that, I'm not well versed in a lot of the other typical King Arthur legends. And even that is a little bit foggy in my memory now, that it was back from 2014 that I read it. But I was, as I read this, I was trying to compare it with what I knew about the canonical King Arthur stories. According to Wikipedia, this is based on the original King Arthur stories, but Howard Pyle is inventing some stories of his own and twisting some stuff around. If anybody in the comment section maybe knows better than me what Howard Pyle was taking from the older sources and what he was inventing, you can let me know. I largely gave up on trying to track it because, well, why would you? I'm not a source critic. I'm just, eventually, at a certain point I decided I was just going to enjoy this book for what it was. And besides which, this book is itself now considered a classic. All the way back from 1903, still in print nowadays. So this, you could make an argument that whatever is in this book is now part of the canon just by default of it being considered a classic nowadays. The book is divided into 2 books. So it says book 1, is this going to show up? The Book of King Arthur, and then book 2 is the Book of Three Worthies. Now, of course, it's all one volume, but it's just a naming convention of calling it 2 different books. So the Book of King Arthur is divided into 3 parts. Part 1, the winning of kinghood, which is essentially the sword and the stone story, which most people are familiar with. I was familiar with it from T.H. White, but even more familiar with it from the Disney version. Of course, before T.H. White and before Disney, the Sword and the Stone story just consisted of that end part, where they're at the tournament and he draws the sword from the stone. The part about Merlin tutoring Arthur was invented by T.H. White and then made famous in the Disney version. So this is just a story of how they go to the tournament and how King Arthur gets the sword out of the anvil, which takes about 40 pages. It drags on a little bit, especially because I think every modern reader knows what the story is, where it's going. There is a certain sense of, okay, come on, let's get going. But for the most part, it's fairly readable. The whole book is definitely readable enough. Then part 2, The Winning of the Sword. So this is how King Arthur gets Excalibur. Now, if you're a little bit confused here, if you thought, well, I thought Excalibur was the sword in the stone. In some versions of the story, Excalibur is a sword in the stone. But in other versions of the story, Excalibur is not the sword in the stone. I think actually in most traditional versions, and the more famous versions, Excalibur is not the sword in the stone. So King Arthur is using the sword in the stone to fight another knight. The sword shatters at the hilt. So then he and Merlin go on a quest to get another sword, which they get from the lady in the lake, who gives them that. And then part 3 is The Winning of the Queen. Now, part 3 is, I talked about the original sources earlier. Part 3 is a part that I can't find in any other source. I don't think this is from Thomas Mallory. I was looking on Wikipedia to try and figure out where it's from. I can't find it, which doesn't mean it's not there, because, I'm not an expert. Somebody knows where the story is from. Maybe you could let me know in the comments. Did Howard Pyle just make this up? I don't know. But the story is, King Arthur has gotten a glimpse of Guinevere from the previous story, where he was wounded on the sickbed, and she passed through, and he got a glimpse of her in the room, and she was very caring, and he fell in love with her. But then later in the story, Guinevere's father, King Leonidas, I think is his name, is under siege by an evil duke who's demanding Guinevere get Guinevere's hand in marriage for his cousin or something. So Leonidas is looking for a champion to help him save him and Guinevere. King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table. No, sorry, that's the Round Table comes later. King Arthur and his army go over to this area. But King Arthur becomes so infatuated with Guinevere, who he had seen once before, that he has Merlin disguise him as like an ugly gardener boy wearing this magic cap, which changes his appearance. And he's hiding out in Guinevere's garden, just as the gardening boy. But Guinevere knows something's up, because whenever he takes off the hat to wash himself or something like that, he gets transformed into this beautiful knight. And Guinevere's handmaidens are saying, oh, there's this really gorgeous knight in your gardens. But whenever Guinevere goes out, she just sees the ugly gardener boy. And there are various other strange things going on. And while this is going on, King Arthur will sneak out to disguise himself as this unknown knight and perform feats of valor, and eventually defeat the evil Duke and his cousin who are threatening Guinevere and her father. Again, I can't figure out where this story comes from. Somebody let me know if you know if Howard Pyle is just making it up or something like that. I found it a little bit. It went on a little bit too long for my tastes. It was readable enough. I got a little bit bored with it. And I thought it dragged on a bit. And I thought, okay, this whole thing about Guinevere not knowing who that mysterious gardener boy is went on a little bit too long. It seemed like Guinevere would discover something, but then later forget it later on. I don't know. But then we come to the end of that book, and then we have the Book of Three Worthies, which are the stories of the people associated with King Arthur's court. So the story of Merlin, the story of Sir Peleus, and the story of Sir Gawain. But this doesn't necessarily mean that we're to the end of the King Arthur story. In fact, we're not. The King Arthur story is interwoven throughout these other three books. Throughout these other three parts. So the story of Merlin is the story of how Merlin falls in love with a young apprentice who eventually betrays him. Now, this again is another story that comes from Thomas Malory, among other sources, and was in The Once and Future King. Although it's told a little bit differently here. In The Once and Future King, it was a woman named Nimue, I think, Nimue. Here it's a woman called Vivian, spelled with an E, like Vivien. And Merlin doesn't get trapped in the crystal cave like he does in Malory's version. He gets imprisoned in this magical castle, and then the castle and Merlin with it just disappear, which seems to imply that Merlin's existence comes to an end. Not as in the Malory version where he's still alive but trapped in the cave. And then we have Sir Peleus and Sir Gawain. Let me actually back up maybe and make a few general comments about these stories. Something that's very appealing about this book is that Howard Pyle is leaning very hard into the fairy tale romanticism type angle. So, he's describing a lot of idyllic type landscapes, like when King Arthur goes out to get the lake. When King Arthur finds the magic lake where he gets Excalibur, it's described as him and Merlin coming out of the forest, and there's just this land with flowers everywhere, and there's this beautiful shimmering lake surrounded by all these flowers. And I got this sense, even though Howard Pyle was a very famous illustrator back in his day, I got the sense that had he been alive today, he would have been using the computer animation to make those fantasy landscapes. You know what I'm talking about, right? Like if you're a fantasy nerd, I'm sure this is familiar to you. All those beautiful fantasy type landscapes that you see on posters nowadays, or you see all over internet illustrations. Some people use it as wallpaper for their computers, where it's something that looks almost photorealistic, but it's a completely fantastical landscape, which is made creating computer animation and that type of stuff. Where you see like these gorgeous waterfalls and these castles on mountains and stuff like that. I got the sense that Howard Pyle would have been very into that had he been alive during the age of computer illustrations. It definitely seems to be he definitely seems to be trying to evoke those kind of beautiful landscapes in your mind's eye as you're reading this. And then once I realized that, I thought that was part of the fun, and I was doing my best to try and imagine these beautiful landscapes, these beautiful fairy tale type landscapes as I read the book. I'm getting ahead of myself. Along with that, there's very much a fairy tale type logic to these books. So whenever you go into the forest in this book, any type of thing could be in the forest. You go around the corner and you could see like this magical valley all of a sudden in the middle of the forest with this palace and 3 girls outside playing with a ball. And then you go up a little hill and you find a river and a bridge and a castle. Just all these things, all these castles and valleys and palaces are all hidden in the forest. Now, of course, none of this makes logical sense. For one thing, this is King Arthur's kingdom. So, how come he doesn't know about all these castles hidden away in his kingdom? For another thing, it just doesn't make sense to have a castle in the forest because, how would you even get the stones and builders and all, everything necessary to build a castle into the middle of the forest where there are no roads and it's just a bunch of tangled overgrowth of trees and you see what I mean. There's no logical way to get castles into the middle of the forest, but of course we're not operating by logic here. This is all like a enchanted fairy tale type vibe. And not once but several times there's just this magical castle in the middle of the forest. The book gets a bit repetitive. I'll come back to that later. but it's all part of the fun. It reminds me of the when I was a child, I used to walk around in the woods behind our house, and I had this idea of as a child that the woods were just infinite, and coming around the corner, you could come across anything. You never knew what was going to be in the woods, which I think is a common childlike view of the forest or nature like that. And that is definitely the logic you're going with in this book. And that's all part of the fun of it. Where this book is a little bit tiresome, in my opinion, is a number of the plot beats are very repetitive. And particularly the conflict and the resolution. So almost everything ends with a fight between two knights, and it's always jousting. So I don't think he ever uses the word jousting anywhere in this book, but jousting is a term everyone is familiar with, right? The knights have the spears, they ride on the horses towards each other, the spears hit the other shields. And that happens over and over and over again in this book. I wish I had thought to keep a running tally of how many times knights joust against each other in this book, because it's something like twice a chapter or something like that. It's ridiculous. Now, the jousting almost always ends, with one knight's spear shattering. So the spears will hit the other knight's shield, and one of them will shatter. They're made of wood, or at least the long parts of them are, and one of them will hold. And so the knights, occasionally they're both shatter. This happens when King Arthur is fighting the Sable Knight, but that's rare. Usually only one spear will shatter and one spear will hold. And then the spear that holds will take the other knight off of his horse, and then he'll be knocked down onto the ground, and that will signal that he's defeated. Now, as far as I can tell from everything that's in this book, it appears to be just pure luck whose spear will hold and whose spear will shatter, which seems to make it a little bit silly. Now, I don't know if there's a technique, if you have to angle the spear a certain way or something like that, but certainly if there is any technique, it's not in this book. The way it's portrayed in this book, it just seems to be pure luck whose spear will shatter and whose spear will hold. And yet the characters within this book seem to think that whoever gets knocked off their horse is the lesser knight, and whoever stays on his horse is the greater knight. And they get so upset by things like this. And that's another point. The knights in this book they've got such fragile egos. They're so obsessed with their honor and being the best knight and trying to knock the other person off their horse. And then if they get knocked off their horse, there's a lot of tears and lamentations about how they're not the best knight. And they're always getting in these fights. Anytime one knight meets another knight, they'll find some excuse, whether it's just for honor or whether it's just you looked at me wrong. Occasionally, the excuses can be a bit repetitive. So, for example, when King Arthur goes to fight the Sable Knight, there's a shield, and it says, "Whoever strikes this shield does so at their peril." So King Arthur strikes the shield, because that's what you do when you see that written. And then the Sable Knight comes out of his castle, and then they have to fight. Whereas then 50 pages later, when King Arthur is, during the part where he's disguised in Guinevere's garden, and he goes out disguised as a mystery knight, then he sees a same thing, a shield hanging from a tree, and it says, "Whoever strikes this shield does so at their peril." So he strikes the shield, and then another knight comes out, and then they have to fight. Which struck me as repetitive. I mean, I don't know if this was a common thing back in those days or a common thing in these stories, but, once is enough. Having a mystery shield where it's written, whoever strikes this shield does so at their own peril. Once, as an author, once you've used that up, you've used that up. Move on to another provocation for two knights fighting later in the book. But I guess to get the story moving, you just have to have these knights fighting all the time, and there's only so many things you can do. I guess I don't know. So the conflict is always the two knights fighting each other, and it's always told in very repetitive terms. I mean, I like a good action scene as much as the next person, like vicariously fighting it out with the characters and imagining these scenes, but it just gets so repetitive. It's always just two knights running towards each other. One spear breaks, one spear holds. But in addition to it being repetitive, something I alluded to earlier is these knights are very quarrelsome and seem to have very fragile egos and are very petty and preening, quick-tempered, etc. Which is fine. As part of the story. But what makes it a little bit odd is Howard Pyle is repeatedly throughout the story trying to hold these guys up as moral exemplars. For example, from the foreword here, he says, "For when in pursuing this history, I have come to consider the high nobility of spirit that moved these excellent men to act as they did, I felt that they might have afforded such a perfect example of courage and humility that anyone might do exceedingly well to follow their manner of behavior in such as he is able to do." So that's the foreword to this book, and then that's repeated a few more times throughout the book. But then these knights just act as petulant children throughout the book, and King Arthur himself as well, and just get into all these stupid tournaments, and I don't know if this is an example of, I would have been able to tolerate all of this if it had just been simply part of the story. Like, okay, these knights are, it's a little bit silly, but these are just the conventions of the chivalric romances. But then to have a character from the modern era, and I'm considering an author from the modern era, and I'm considering 1903 to be included in the modern era after the French Revolution, to hold these up as moral exemplars and say to his audience of intended children, I'm telling you these wonderful stories because I want you to realize how virtuous these people are and you should act like them. That struck me as a bit strange. And that's a theme that gets repeated throughout the book. The other thing that gets repeated throughout the book every time we come to a conclusion or a foreword, because every time we start a new section there's a new foreword, is he keeps writing about how much he enjoys these stories. He keeps saying all the time, "I've gotten such joy out of retelling these stories," which struck me as a bit excessive to say it several times. Maybe just write that once at the beginning of the foreword. But whatever, I guess Howard Pyle really loved writing these stories for whatever reason. But if he loved writing these stories so much, I don't know, it appears he got a bit lazy in the writing of them because of all the repetitive elements that I mentioned earlier. I realize I'm kind of ripping into this book a bit, but I should emphasize I did not hate it. I found parts of it to drag on a little bit, and okay, come on, pick this up a little bit. Particularly the first half of the book, the Sword in the Stone story, and the part where King Arthur is hiding out in Guinevere's garden. But on the whole, it was a very pleasant. It was a moderately pleasant read. Sorry, I don't want to overdo it. Very is pushing it, but it was definitely a moderately pleasant read. You you've got to get yourself in the style or in the mindset of reading a fairy tale, and then just going with all the enchanted logic that goes with it. So it could be definitely kind of fun, although a bit repetitive at times. Okay, I'll sign out here.